I've just been in Finland, and they had a wonderful school there too. Again, 300, reached the maximum 300 also. You know, this theme of the school being the Bab, both from the point of view of his life, his position, and also his writings, provides for us an occasion to remember or recall, or in many cases perhaps learn things that we hadn't seen before. But in a sense, it's a rehearsal of things we have studied and known about all of our lives. We're called about on this occasion, in this, the House have called it a moment, but it also, of course, is a holy year, and provides us many opportunities to recall the Bab and speak of the Bab. But how do we speak of the Bab? If you were asked, who is the Bab? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? If you were to have someone ask you what's the position of the Bab, I think most of us would fall back on what he's kind of like John the Baptist. In the course of these review of some of the writings that are planned for these sessions, I think we'll find that there are similarities with John the Baptist, but he far exceeds anything of that order. And these quotations have been drawn, for the most part, from Shoghi Effendi's writings. Now, Shoghi Effendi did not live during the life of the Bab. He approached the editing of the Nabil's narrative early on in his ministry, which was a terrific gift to the Baha'i world. And then he expounded on the position of the Bab. One of the things he had to do was to raise the understanding of the Bab in comparison with Abdul Baha, because the friends in the West had fallen into the habit of referring to Abdul Baha as the return of Christ. If Baha'u'llah was the father, then the son would be Jesus Christ. How many times Abdul Baha worked at removing that impression that he was not a manifestation of God, and that becomes quite clear. But the friends also didn't have a clear idea of the Bab. There wasn't much available. Some little histories, of course, with the launching of the Dawnbreakers, the whole picture became much clearer. And gradually, the friends in the West, stumbling along over various Persian names, came to some understanding of the basic history of the faith. Now, the people that are teaching the Dawnbreakers these days review at the beginning a kind of 15, 20 minutes of pronunciation and have everybody pronouncing the names 4 or 5 times. It helps, you know. The old way of just skipping, when we get to the names, we say, and yeah, here's another one of those names, and we go to the next thing. By the time the characters reappear throughout the book, we don't remember whether we've ever seen this name or not, because we're not looking at the names. So it's very important in Dawnbreaker studies to make a point of finding out who is it that's appearing throughout the narrative. And also finding out people with the same name, because suddenly you find here's somebody talking who died in Sheikh Tabarsi, and you wonder how it is that he's talking again. But they have the same name, so there's a number of those things to be resolved also. In looking at the whole question of reviewing the nature of the Bab, I found myself gathering quotations under various aspects. The ones that I collected here are, first, his mission; second, his declaration; his rank and station; his titles; his person. How would you describe the person of the Bab? His ministry, different from the mission. The mission is what he came for. The ministry is how he did it. His covenant, so important, and the most powerful covenant really revealed prior to the Baha'i covenant. Then we have, of course, his martyrdom, his relationship, as he draws a parallel with the the ministry and the sufferings of Jesus Christ in God Passes By. A very interesting comparison he makes. We'll examine that a bit. Then his relation to Baha'u'llah. Who was the Bab? Who was Baha'u'llah? Are they both the same? Are they different? In what way? And finally, his impact on the world. The review that the Guardian makes in several places of what's the effect of the Bab in the long run on human society, and how is that still operating? So it's a kind of a big program. Let's see how we can proceed. The Guardian, during his ministry, on 2 occasions had to summarize the faith for officials. One time for the High Commissioner, when it was necessary to state what the faith is and who the Bab was, to remove the challenge of a road that had been voted in to pass by appropriately. I'm sure people who decided that, they thought that would be a good idea to have a road that would pass directly in front of the shrine of the Bab, such an important place. And the Guardian contended that that wouldn't be respectful and that the Baha'i world would be very much up in arms about it. But in the process, he describes who the Bab is. So we have that briefest of summaries of his mission. Then we also later on, when the state of Israel was being contemplated by the UN, and we had a committee, an international United Nations committee that looked at the religions in the Holy Land and what their role was and what their position was. And they asked the Guardian for a summary, and he gave this marvelous summary, which is perhaps I think the best summary we have in English of what the Baha'i religion is all about. He also then reduces the whole ministry of the Bab to a paragraph. What would you put in the paragraph? What did he put in the paragraph? From these 2 statements we have, the forerunner of the faith was Mirza Ali Muhammad of Shiraz, known as the Bab, who proclaimed on May 23, 1844, his twofold mission as an independent manifestation of God and herald of one greater than himself, who would inaugurate a new and unprecedented era in the religious history of mankind. Wow, the whole picture is right there. In the other summary, he says the Baha'i faith revolves around 3 central figures, the first of whom was a youth, a native of Shiraz, named Mirza Ali Muhammad, known as the Bab, who in May 1844, at the age of 25, advanced the claim of being the herald who, according to sacred scriptures of previous dispensations, must needs announce and prepare the way for the advent of one greater than himself, whose mission would be, according to those same scriptures, to inaugurate an era of righteousness and peace, an era that would be hailed as the consummation of all previous dispensations, and initiate a new cycle in the religious history of mankind. So again, we see how far-reaching the mission of the Bab is, how far it is intended to reach, to encompass this era of righteousness and peace. This twofold mission of the Bab is elaborated in various ways in the writings of the Guardian. We'll come back to that, but for the drama of it and the launching of it, let's look a little at the declaration of the Bab, which we were all familiar with to some degree. And to do this, I thought it would be good to repeat the words of Mullah Hussein, because it's really the one that's given us the history of that. But interestingly enough, the Guardian, in presenting in God Passes By those elements which would recreate for us the declaration of the Bab, he cites on the one hand the testimony of Mullah Hussein, and on the other the first chapter of the Qayyum al-Asma, which the Bab revealed on that very night of the declaration, as constituting the elements which would identify the focus and importance of that event. This revelation, Mullah Hussein has further testified, so suddenly and impetuously thrust upon me, came as a thunderbolt which for a time seemed to have benumbed my faculties. I was blinded by its dazzling splendor and overwhelmed by its crushing force. Excitement, joy, awe, and wonder stirred the depths of my soul. Predominant among these emotions was a sense of gladness and strength which seemed to have transfigured me. How feeble and impotent, how dejected and timid I had felt previously. Then I could neither write nor walk, so tremulous were my hands and feet. Now, however, the knowledge of his revelation had galvanized my being. I felt possessed of such courage and power that were the world, all its peoples and its potentates, to rise against me, I would, alone and undaunted, withstand their onslaught. The universe seemed to be a handful of dust in my grasp. I seemed to be the voice of Gabriel personified, calling unto all mankind, "Awake, for lo, the morning light is broken. Arise, for his cause is made manifest. The portal of his grace is wide open. Enter therein, O peoples of the world, for he who is your promised one is come." The Guardian then continues. He says, a more significant light, however, is shed on this episode, marking the declaration of the mission of the Bab by the perusal of that first, greatest, and mightiest of all books in the Babi dispensation, the celebrated commentary on the Surah of Joseph, the first chapter of which, we are assured, proceeded in its entirety in the course of that night of nights from the pen of its divine revealer. The description of this episode by Mullah Hussein, as well as the opening pages of that book, attest the magnitude and force of that weighty declaration. Now, friends, there have been some would-be Baha'i scholars along the way who have expressed their own opinions and views, one of which was that the Bab gradually came to an understanding of who he was. He didn't at first know who he was, but he saw in the end that he could even claim to be the Qayyim, so he did that. Well, this is a really a very short view, an improper view. And dear Dr. Saidi has addressed this in his writings, a number of the strange statements they say and how they didn't understand, they couldn't penetrate the writings of the Bab. And there was a depreciation there that doesn't need to exist and it now has been dispelled. Listen to the Guardian's summary of this first book and ask yourself, did he know who he was, or he didn't know who he was? I mean, the question hardly arises if you think about the content of what he declared and what he recited then, revealed for Mullah Hussein on that occasion. A claim to be no less than the mouthpiece of God himself, promised by the prophets of bygone ages. The assertion that he was at the same time the herald of one immeasurably greater than himself. The summons which he trumpeted forth to the kings and princes of the earth. The dire warnings directed to the chief magistrate of the realm, Muhammad Shah. Doesn't sound very timid, does it? The counsel imparted to Haji Mirza Agassi to fear God, and the peremptory command to abdicate his authority as Grand Vizier of the Shah and submit to the one who is the inheritor of the earth and all that is therein. The challenge issued to the rulers of the world, proclaiming the self-sufficiency of his cause, denouncing the vanity of their ephemeral power, and calling upon them to lay aside one and all their dominion and deliver his message to lands in both the east and the west. These constitute the dominant features of that initial contact that marked the birth, fixed the date of the inception of the most glorious era in the spiritual life of mankind. The inception of the most glorious era in the spiritual life of mankind. What a day we live in. We've popped into existence, and we could have been another time. We could have been 250 years ago. We wouldn't know a thing about any of this. We'd have come to the earth and left the earth completely ignorant of that. But instead of that, we've appeared by the grace of God. We've appeared in the most important moment in 500,000 years. And Shoghi Effendi says, if we realize the priceless opportunities which the efforts we make to serve this cause in any way, to sacrifice ourselves in whatever manner, we wouldn't hesitate an instant if we knew the greatness of it. One place, Abdul Baha says that the acts done in these days are 100, the same act is worth 100 times more now than it will be after 100, 200 years. We have a very, very unique opportunity here to react to the coming of the new day. Now, a personal note. After the convention in 1973, through the kindness of Ali Naqshbandi, I was able to go on pilgrimage to Iran and travel all around the country. At one point, the friends of the assembly sent me south to Shiraz. And the Muhammad Afnan, the caretaker of the shrine, was there. I was alone. He was alone. He said, my family are in England. Come, you stay with me in my house. And so I was there for 3 days. The third day actually turned out to be the anniversary of the declaration of the Bab. And according to tradition, the Afnans gather in the room where the declaration was made at 2 hours and 11 minutes after sunset and chant the first chapter of the Qayyum al-Asma. And as I was a guest in the house of the Afghans, somehow I managed to get in that crowd. And I was in that house that evening. What a terrific... I mean, I'd been visiting the house for a couple of days. In fact, he had encouraged me to take a series of photographs, which became the basis of a slide program that the House of Justice sent out to the world, because I was photographing all the rooms and he was explaining which were the bedrooms, where was the different rooms of the mother of the Bab and so on, all of those various points. But now that whole thing is gone, and we would say, what a loss, this is irreparable loss. The house of Baha'u'llah in Baghdad is gone. But there is a tablet from Baha'u'llah which states very clearly that the holy places are not the material substance of those places. That there is a spiritual ordination that creates that holy place. And if we put the buildings back again, it's identical to the original holy place, because it didn't depend on the bricks and the dust of the place, but on the spiritual ordination of the place. You might ask yourself, what happened to Mecca and the Qibla when it was changed from there to the Holy Land? The next aspect is to explore a bit more the rank and station of the Bab. Shoghi Effendi, after elaborating on the greatness and character of the revelation of Baha'u'llah in his masterful message, The Dispensation of Baha'u'llah, writes the following. He says, not only in the character of the revelation of Baha'u'llah, however stupendous be his claim, does the greatness of this dispensation reside. Not alone in that, for among the distinguishing features of his faith ranks as a further evidence of its uniqueness the fundamental truth that in the person of its forerunner, the Bab, every follower of Baha'u'llah recognizes not merely an inspired annunciator, but a direct manifestation of God. It's their firm belief that no matter how short the duration of his dispensation, and however brief the period of the operation of his laws, The Bab had been endowed with a potency such as no founder of any of the past religions was in the providence of the Almighty allowed to possess. A potency surpassing all the manifestations of God of recorded history. That he was not merely the precursor of the revelation of Baha'u'llah, that he was more than a divinely inspired personage, that his was a station of an independent, self-sufficient manifestation of God, is abundantly demonstrated by himself, is affirmed unmistakably in unmistakable terms by Baha'u'llah, and is finally attested by the will and testament of Abdu'l-Baha. Nowhere but in the Kitab-i-Iqan, Baha'u'llah's masterly exposition of the one unifying truth underlying all the revelations of the past, can we obtain a clearer apprehension of the potency of those forces inherent in that preliminary manifestation with which his own faith stands indissolubly associated. Iqan is a defense of the Babi dispensation, of the Bab's mission. Look how he's defined here the Iqan. Also, if you find in the sentence of the Guardian extra special things, he defines the Iqan as Baha'u'llah's masterly exposition of the one unifying truth underlying all the revelations of the past. If you were asked, what's the Kitab-i-Iqan about? Here's the shortest answer that I've seen so far. Expatiating upon the unfathomed import of the signs and tokens that have accompanied the revelation proclaimed by the Bab, the promised Qaim, he recalls these prophetic words. This is Baha'u'llah in the Iqan. You'll recall this. Knowledge is 20 and 7 letters. All that the prophets have revealed are 2 letters thereof. No man thus far hath known more than these 2 letters. But when the Qaim shall arise, he will cause the remaining 20 and 5 letters to be made manifest. Behold, adds Baha'u'llah, how great and lofty is his station. Of his revelation, the prophets of God, his saints and chosen ones, have either not been informed or in pursuance of God's inscrutable decree, they have not disclosed. Mysterious. One of the friends in the West wrote and said that some of the alphabets have 28 letters. How do we understand this? It doesn't have to do with the letters of the alphabet. It seems clear enough. It has to do, if you could divide knowledge into 27 different packets, 2 have been delivered before, and the Bab has brought the other 25. Never mind what your alphabet, local alphabet is. That the Bab, the inaugurator of the Babi dispensation, is fully entitled to rank as one of the self-sufficient manifestations of God, that he has been invested with sovereign power and authority and exercises all the rights and prerogatives of independent prophethood, is yet another fundamental verity which the message of Baha'u'llah insistently proclaims and which its followers must uncompromisingly uphold. That he is not to be regarded merely as an inspired precursor of the Baha'i revelation. That in his person, as he himself bears witness in the Persian Bayan, the object of all the prophets gone before him has been fulfilled. This is a truth that I feel it my duty to demonstrate and emphasize. We would assuredly be failing in our duty to the faith we profess and would be violating one of its basic and sacred principles if in our words or by our conduct we hesitate to recognize the implications of this root principle of Baha'i belief, or refuse to uphold unreservedly its integrity and demonstrate its truth. Indeed, the chief motive actuating me to undertake the task of editing and translating Nabil's immortal narrative has been to enable every follower of the faith in the West to better understand and more readily grasp the tremendous implications of his exalted station, and to more ardently admire and love him. There can be no doubt that the claim to the twofold station ordained for the Bab by the Almighty, a claim which he himself has so boldly advanced, which Baha'u'llah has repeatedly affirmed, and to which the will and testament of Abdul-Baha has finally given the sanction of its testimony, constitutes the most distinctive feature of the Baha'i dispensation. My goodness. Somebody asked you, what's the most distinctive feature of the Baha'i dispensation? I doubt that many of us, I wouldn't have, before I reread all these, I wouldn't have said that it was this, but this is what he's pointing out here. It's further evidence of its uniqueness, a tremendous accession to the strength, to the mysterious power and authority with which this holy cycle has been invested. Indeed, the greatness of the Bab consists primarily not in his being the divinely appointed forerunner of so transcendent a revelation, but rather in his having been invested with the powers inherent in the inaugurator of a separate religious dispensation, and in his wielding to a degree unrivaled by the messengers gone before him the scepter of independent prophethood. The short duration of his dispensation, the restricted range within which his laws and ordinances have been made to operate, supply no criterion whatever wherewith to judge its divine origin and to evaluate the potency of its message. That so brief a span, Baha'u'llah himself explains, should have separated this most mighty and wondrous revelation from mine own previous manifestation, is a secret that no man can unravel, and a mystery such as no mind can fathom. Its duration had been foreordained, and no man shall ever discover its reason unless and until he be informed of the contents of my hidden book. Suggests it's a bit out of our range of understanding. If he doesn't tell us these things, how would we possibly come to these conclusions? The marvelous happenings that have heralded the advent of the founder of the Babi dispensation, the dramatic circumstances of his own eventful life, the miraculous tragedy of his martyrdom, the magic of his influence exerted on the most eminent and powerful among his countrymen, to all of which every chapter of Nabil's stirring narrative testifies, should in themselves be regarded as sufficient evidence of the validity of his claim to so exalted a station among the prophets. A little bit of a digression, friends. A few letters from Shoghi Effendi about the significance of the Dawnbreakers and why he undertook to translate it. These are letters written on Shoghi Effendi's behalf by his secretaries. He was deeply gratified to learn that the reading of the Dawnbreakers has deepened your knowledge of the cause and has inflamed you with new courage and faith. The tale of these immortal heroes of God, so well narrated by the powerful pen of Nabil, is indeed stimulating and spiritually uplifting. It gives the reader a new vision of the cause and unfolds before his eyes the glory of this new manifestation in a manner hitherto unknown. Nabil's narrative is not merely a narrative, it is a book of meditation. It does not only teach, it actually inspires and incites to action. It quickens and stimulates our dormant energies and makes us soar on a higher plane. It is thus of an invaluable help to the historian, as well as to every teacher and expounder of the cause. Friends, this has not been published widely, but it's included in Ali Naqshbani's book, Shoghi Effendi, The Range and Power of His Pen. And it's one of the most powerful paragraphs about his description of Nabil's narrative, especially this thing about a book of meditation. How do these things affect our life? How do these things expand and change our own vision of the cause and of our possible support to it? In another letter, he says, I would strongly urge you to utilize to the utmost possible extent the wealth of authentic material gathered in Nabil's stirring narrative, and to encourage the youth to master and digest the facts recorded therein as a basis for their future work in the teaching field and as a sustenance to their spiritual life and activities in the service of the cause. Special call to Baha'i youth here. Encourage the youth to master and digest the facts. Ooh. Not read the book, friends. We got something more going on here, doesn't it? Well, he's asking, master and digest the facts recorded there as a basis for their teaching work and as a sustenance to their spiritual life and activities. Oh, ye youth amongst us, or are you all in someplace else right now? I don't know where they are. Again, he fully approves the idea of holding study classes, for the deeper the friends go in their understanding of their teachings, the more firm and steadfast they will become, and the more unwavering in their support of the institutions of the faith. Books such as the Gone, Some Answered Questions, and the Dawnbreakers should be mastered by every Baha'i. What? These books, he says, should be mastered by every Baha'i, not would-be teachers. I mean, we're all would-be teachers. We're all called to teach. So I don't know which ones you've mastered and which ones you haven't mastered, but you might want to review that in your minds. They should read these books over and over again. The last book will show you how the faith was ushered into the world and how its early adherents heroically faced martyrdom and suffering in their desire to establish the cause throughout the world. Knowing the life of those heroes will create in us the urge to follow their footsteps and achieve the same. Achieve the same. Good gracious, what a promise that is. There are heroic acts to be performed at this time. Every step of unfoldment of the cause provided unique opportunities. Do we beg Baha'u'llah to let us participate in some way, in some manner, contribute something? And finally, he writes, no one can read the Dawnbreakers and remain cold and unreceptive. The deeds of those heroic souls are bound to stir the reader and win his support. Who can see what they experienced in the path of God and remain apathetic? However, back to the narrative of the Guardian. However graphic the record which the eminent chronicler of his life has transmitted to posterity, so luminous a narrative must pale before the glowing tribute paid to the Bab by the pen of Baha'u'llah. Now, before I get into that, I just want to mention briefly that Nabil had been collecting these stories and accounts throughout the ministry of Baha'u'llah. And this is now years later, 1888, 1889. Baha'u'llah finally calls Nabil, who's residing in the Holy Land, calls him to account, and he said, I want you to write now, to pen your narrative. And I want it to be divided into 30 parts, each part to be delivered Wednesday afternoon at 3 o'clock to my presence. Wow. So Nabil got busy, and he would submit a fascicle of the Dawnbreakers, a portion of the Dawnbreakers, each week to Baha'u'llah. And it's recounted that Agha John would read sections of it to him. We don't know whether he read it all, but he certainly had knowledge of it all. He had knowledge of everything. So at the end of the period, and Nabil created a narrative that came right up to the moment of the passing of Baha'u'llah, so that he finished it after, when Baha'u'llah had passed away. He also writes some account of what was going on before he took his own life. So it's quite complete. It's not written in 2 books. It's viewed as 2 books now because the Guardian only translated the portion up to the time after the martyrdom of the Bab and after the sufferings in Tehran, before the experience of the Siyad of Baha'u'llah. And the rest of the volume contains accounts of various sorts, some of which, the key ones, have been taken from Nabil's narrative and included in God Passes By. And then also the House of Justice allowed Mr. Balyuzi, the hand of the cause, to study the original manuscript in the Holy Land and take out materials for Baha'u'llah, King of Glory. The rest of it is not terribly significant because it didn't have the drama of the early days, that very, the period of the persecutions in the cradle of the faith was quite intense, and there were so many things happening. You think about it. I mean, Iran has done its best to erase this history, but the Bab convulsed the whole country. There wasn't anybody that didn't have to take a decision. Is he the Qaim or not the Qaim? It came to everybody's heart. In a country with no social media, no newspapers, no radio, no television, all word of mouth, rumors passing everywhere and passing very quickly, amazing stories that you can perceive, of what was happening in the country. Every miracle of the Bab would get recounted. Every quotation that someone heard would be misquoted and broadcast all over. And yet it stirred the country. It's an amazing impact. I mean, there isn't the history of an impact of a manifestation of God like the Bab, till the Bab. And even after Baha'u'llah, of course, his reaches out in another way, but it's not with that intense drama that the short ministry of the Bab contained and conveyed. Again, these is commentary of Shoghi Effendi about the Iqan. He says, where else, if not in the Kitab Iqan, can the student of the Babi dispensation seek to find those affirmations that unmistakably attest the power and spirit which no man, except he be a manifestation of God, can manifest? How could such a thing, exclaims Baha'u'llah, be made manifest except through the power of a divine revelation and the potency of God's invincible will? By the righteousness of God, were anyone to entertain so great a revelation in his heart, the thought of such a declaration would alone confound him. Were the hearts of all men to be crowded into his heart, he would still hesitate to venture upon so awful an enterprise. We don't have all the means of doing it, but think, if you were called to be a manifestation of God, you were a human being like we all are, and you knew that how the people would react when you announced that I'm from God and I'm a messenger of God and I've come here to give you a book to tell you how to live on behalf of the Creator. Yeah, sure. Yeah. And if you're from the mercer class, from the merchants, involved in business and never went to the schools of the divines and never showed signs of memorizing the Quran and all the things that would be necessary to even open your mouth. I mean, it wasn't allowed for the common man in Iran to make a pronouncement about religion, much less to announce his coming as a prophetic figure. Just as he's talking about what kind of a challenge that the Bab met. How did he know? You know, they had to protect the Bab. The Bab sent out the letters of the living. They were allowed to announce that the Qaim, or the promised message was appearing, but they weren't allowed to say who he was or where he was. So this also caused so much speculation in the country. Who is? Where is he? Who is he? Where is he? But then the verses, he familiarized themselves with these verses that he was revealing. These parts from the Qayyum al-Asma and other documents that he sent with him, the message that he gave to the letters of the living before he launched them out into the country. What an impact that had. No eye, he in another passage affirms, hath beheld so great an outpouring of bounty, nor hath any ear heard of such a revelation of loving kindness. The prophets endowed with constancy, whose loftiness and glory shine as the sun, were each honored with a book which all have seen, and the verses of which have been duly ascertained. Whereas the verses which have rained from this cloud of divine mercy have been so abundant that none hath yet been able to estimate their number. How can they belittle this revelation? Hath any age witnessed such momentous happenings? We'll come back to this question of the quantity of the Bab's revelation. Wishing to stress the sublimity of the Bab's exalted station as compared with that of the prophets of the past, Baha'u'llah in that same epistle asserts, no understanding can grasp the nature of his revelation, nor can any knowledge comprehend the full measure of his faith. Those were the words of Baha'u'llah about the Bab. Now some extracts from the Bab himself about his position and station. I am the mystic Fain. The Bab thus proclaims his station in the Qayyum al-Asma, which the hand of omnipotence hath reared. I am the lamp which the finger of God hath lit within its niche and caused to shine with deathless splendor. I am the flame of that supernal light that glowed upon Sinai in the gladsome spot and lay concealed in the midst of the burning bush. Should it be our wish, he again affirms, it is in our power to compel, through the agency of but one letter of our revelation, the world and all that is therein to recognize in less than the twinkling of an eye the truth of our cause. What kind of hidden powers does that reflect? My God. I am the primal point. The Bab thus addresses Muhammad Shah from the prison fortress of Maku. This is not an unknown term in Islam. It would have been a startling declaration to say, I am the primal point, from which have been generated all created things. I am the countenance of God, whose splendor can never be obscured, the light of God, whose radiance can never fade. You know, I've heard some friends say that some of the prophets are not always so modest, you know. I mean, they make these terrible claims. We should remind ourselves, is there anyone that can tell us who they are if they don't tell us who they are? How would anybody assess their nature if they didn't reveal some of it to us? And all of that they reveal at a level that corresponds. It's a relative truth to our possible understanding within the cycle that we're living and in the period of creation that we have been brought into being. All the keys of heaven God hath chosen to place on my right hand, and all the keys of hell on my left. I am one of the sustaining pillars of the primal word of God. Whosoever hath recognized me hath known all that is true and right, and hath attained all that is good and seemly. The substance wherewith God hath created me is not the clay out of which others have been formed. He hath conferred upon me that which the worldly wise can never comprehend, nor the faithful discover. To these authoritative assertions and solemn declarations made by Baha'u'llah and the Bab must be added Abdu'l-Baha's own incontrovertible testimony. He, the appointed interpreter of the utterances of both Baha'u'llah and the Bab, corroborates, not by implication, but in clear and categorical language, both in his tablets and in his testament, the truth of the statements to which I've already referred. Every proof and prophecy, Abdu'l-Baha says, every manner of evidence, whether based on reason or on the text of the scriptures and traditions, are to be regarded as centered in the persons of Baha'u'llah and the Bab. In them is to be found their complete fulfillment. Now again, we have Abdu'l-Baha stating that, so we don't interpret things to mean Abdu'l-Baha. He says they refer to the Bab and Baha'u'llah. Finally, in the will and testament of Abdu'l-Baha, the repository of his last wishes and parting instructions, he, in the following passage, specifically designed to set forth the guiding principles of Baha'i belief, sets the seal of his testimony on the Bab's dual and exalted station. The foundation of the people of Baha, may my life be offered up for them, is this: His Holiness, the Exalted One, the Bab, is the manifestation of the unity and oneness of God, and the forerunner of the ancient beauty, Baha'u'llah. His Holiness, the Abha beauty, may my life be offered up as a sacrifice for his steadfast friends, is the supreme manifestation of God and the dayspring of his most divine essence. Then he significantly adds, all others are servants unto him and do his bidding. A review. When Shoghi Effendi comes to a point of summarizing these in the first 5 chapters of God Passes By, where all of these things are laid out in such clarity, he chooses certain titles that Baha'u'llah has used with which to refer to the Bab. These are the 5 that he's chosen. The essence of essence, the sea of seas, the point round whom the realities of the prophets and messengers revolve, from whom God hath caused to proceed the knowledge of all that was and shall be, whose rank excelleth that of all the prophets, whose revelation transcendeth the comprehension and understanding of all their chosen ones. Beyond that, we're familiar ourselves, particularly in the Tablet of Ahmad, where Baha'u'llah refers to the Bab as the king of the messengers of God. Wonder what the implications of being the king of the messengers of God are in the other world. We see it as his rank excelleth all the other previous manifestations of God. It's easily to see in the numbers that the World Center has recorded, digitally recorded, of the writings of the Bab, that his revelation more than doubles the sum of all the prophets' holy books of the past. If you measure them, the Bab is revealed that much, and then at least that much more, again, independently. This is such an outpouring, never been witnessed prior to the coming of the Bab, at least in our recorded history. I had the bounty of working under the hand of the cause, Jalal Qazi. Colonel Jalal Qazi was a hand of the cause of God, assigned by the hands in the Holy Land with the affirmation of the house to serve in South America as a resident hand of the cause. And as an auxiliary board member, I was under his direction and had the bounty of visiting with him and hearing stories and all kinds of. He was a great storyteller. In fact, his power in firesides was the complexity with which he'd tell stories. It just would attract people to such a degree. And then he had them where he wanted them, and he put the faith right into the hearts of them. It was marvelous. Mr. Qazi was invited to be one of the first 2 pilgrims. After 10 years, there were no pilgrimage to the Holy Land from 41 to 51 because of the war, because of the violation of the Guardian's family, because of the War of Independence in Israel itself. All of this thing kept pilgrimage as an impossibility. There were occasional visitors, but they would land with ships or something, but not an organized pilgrimage program like was known prior to that, and also subsequently in 51 on. And Mr. Qazi was a very practical man. He said, I was a veterinarian by training, a little bit rough. I used to be the governor of tribes. And he said, when I was invited to go, and I had the possibility to go on pilgrimage together with Secretary Khadim, Mr. Khadim, both of these men destined to become hands of the cause subsequently. He said that the friends were saying, the Guardian, he reads your mind, so he knows what you're thinking. And I thought to myself, I don't want to be in the presence of the Guardian with the kind of things that I think, and he's going to know right away what I'm thinking. What am I going to do? I don't know if I should do this. So I went to Mr. Furtan, and he discussed it with Mr. Furtan. Mr. Furtan said, well, yes, he knows, but he doesn't always make you know that he knows. It's a kind of a situation where you have to kind of take your chances here. So he said, I decided to go. So we went. And they were the first 2 pilgrims. They were in the Eastern Pilgrim House. And the first day, he said, the Guardian came up the hill in his car, and we met him, and he accompanied us to the walk together to the shrines, talking about the development of the cause and so many different things over those days. But he said this first day we were going for the first time to the shrine. He said we got to the marble steps, and the Guardian turned to Mr. Khadim and praised him for something he'd done. And it so stunned Mr. Khadim that he fainted right on those steps. Whether the Guardian was upset that he fainted and got down and put his hand under Mr. Khadim's face and was patting him and trying to awaken him, when Mr. Khadim opened his eyes again and saw the Guardian's face right there and fainted again. Mr. Qazi was getting a little impatient. He said, I wanted to get to the shrine. And he said, anyway, they got up onto their feet, and on they went to the shrine. And they entered the shrine, and the Guardian went forward to the tablet of visitation, and he himself chanted for them the tablet of visitation. Imagine standing in the shrine of the Bab with the sign of God, communing with the manifestation of God. What an event. He said, we stood at the very back, as far back as we could get, on the 2 sides. Then he said, after that, the Guardian went to the center, and he prostrated himself, and then he walked out of respect to the shrine. He backed out of the shrine. And we looked at each other just before he got there, saying, where do we turn? Do we keep facing the shrine, or do we turn to the sign of God who's walking past us? Mr. Qazi said, well, I don't know. I didn't see what Mr. Khadim did, but he was a rather portly man. He said it was possible to face both ways at the same time. And the Guardian then passed out of the Guardian. So now the Guardian's out. He said we went forward and we said our prayers. We backed out of the shrine and we came out, and by that time Shoghi Effendi put his shoes on. And he was quietly contemplating and walking back and forth while we put our shoes on. And he said, the greatness of the shrine is not understood. the friends don't understand the greatness of the shrine. So we understood which friends he was talking about. That was fairly clear. And we got our shoes on and we started following him, and he began extolling the shrine and the position of the Bab. And finally, when we reached to the front, we were going to the front of the shrine, he said, and then he said, all the saints and messengers of the past, the holy ones of the concourse on high, circle in adoration the blessed Bab. Oh, Mr. Kaze said, I didn't intend to, but came in my face, my head. He said, for heaven's sake, what's left for Baha'u'llah? Everybody is here circling around the Bab. What's this? He said the guardian was walking ahead of us. He stopped. He turned. He faced directly to me. He smiled. And then he said, and then the Bab and all those that circle around him circle around Baji. Thank you, friends.